Thank you very much. So my name is Rebecca Braun. I'm a Professor of Modern Languages and Creative Futures at Lancaster University, where I'm also co-director of the Institute for Social Futures. And the panel that we've put together today, is very much an ISF, Institute for Social Futures, very much an ISF kind of piece. It's a little bit like coming and spending a Tuesday morning with us. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what the ISF is, just so you can understand what we're trying to do in this panel. The ISF was founded in 2015 with all sorts of aims in mind, but particularly with a core mission of bringing together people from across lots of different disciplines and academe and beyond academe. So really a space to create a new way of thinking and talking about the future. Although we're the Institute of Social Futures, one of our core beliefs at ISF is that we need to find new ways of thinking about what we're doing right now if we're going to avoid the danger of falling into a sort of a fatalistic acceptance of the future. Just let people do what they're doing right now to avoid fatalism. Please do come to this. So it's quite easy to get caught up thinking about the future when you're thinking about the future from your own disciplinary perspective. It's quite easy to get taken up with a particular trend that everyone's talking about in your field, a particular way of thinking about things, or a certain technological development that might seem like it's really going to have some kind of apparently self-evident transformative effect on the bit of the world that's your research expertise. And we think that in the Institute for Social Futures it's really important to manage to stand back from that and get into dialogue with people who bring other perspectives, whether it's from another academic discipline or whether it's that bringing together practical experience with sort of a more theoretical approach to things. So you really need to step outside of your comfort zone and present your ideas to others working in different areas. And that's something that we try to do in all sorts of different ways at the ISF. We're the Institute for Social Futures because the future is inherently relational. It's being made right now by lots of different people doing things, relating to each other, whether planned or not. And it's really actually very difficult. There are very few spaces that one can create where people come together and actually think their things together. How do those combined interactions really affect the different ways that we think about the future, and therefore how should we perhaps be a little more aware of what's going on in all sorts of different walks of life. So the Institute for Social Futures is really emphasising how do we grasp that relationality. In order to grasp how things cohere, you need the input from social sciences and humanities. So we're particularly set up to make sure that we have impetus coming from across the university, that when we're doing futures research, it's not just being led by technology and scientific developments, and although those are of course also core to what we do, but that we're finding a way of bringing that into dialogue with social sciences and humanities. So we're trying to find a way of fleshing out today's visions of the future, fleshing them out with real people and their needs as they're likely to exist tomorrow. And in order to do this, obviously we need to be talking, sharing ideas, and seeing that in the round. Seeing that in the round with quite a lot of people in front of you. So we're also very sociable, we like to have lots of people. Please do find a place to sit so you can actually see the speakers. So my opening message to you is that the time of social futures is right now in this panel, where there are lots of people who are going to be talking to each other from lots of different disciplinary perspectives, and pairing the academic research in future studies with hands-on practical experience drawn from a wealth of different fields. We've brought together 4 pairs of researchers and practitioners from diverse fields who are each going to develop in conversation a couple of key points that they find especially pertinent to the way they're acting in the present in response to different visions of the future. About 15 minutes for each conversation, just so you have a little sense of the format. So we have 4 pairs giving their sense from the fields that they represent, and I'll go on to tell you what the fields are in a minute, about how they're engaging with the challenge of the future in what they do right now, also always informed by the past, and that's something that will come out, I think, in the conversation. So there are obviously points to be made here about when and where social futures start and end, as well as how we talk about them in theory and make them in practice. And it's going to be my job to try and pull out those ideas as the conversations unfold. But it's your job as the audience too to help me, because it's, you know, we've got quite a broad range that we've got here. So the format of what we're doing is also very timely, in as much as I am going to keep everybody to time. So 15 minutes, and after that I say no more, be quiet, you've had your chance. The idea being that we'd like to leave some time at the end, a good 20 minutes or so, to have some exchange across the conversations. At that point, it's quite a cosy setup in here. If people want to include their thoughts, questions, observations from the audience, you're very welcome to. But what I'm not going to do is that awkward kind of, thank you very much for your talks now, I'm sure there are lots of questions. We're just going to let it evolve a little bit more naturally. So if you have something burning that you want to share with us, please do. Okay, on to the speakers. Peter Kalu, who is going to join us in style in a moment, is a poet, storyteller, fiction writer and playwright. He started writing as a member of Manchester, UK's Moss-Side Write Black Writers' Workshop, and has had 8 novels, 2 film scripts and 3 theatre plays produced to date. He is Artistic Director of a Manchester-based writer development organisation, Common Word, and Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. We're going to hear him in conversation with Emily Spires, who's sitting on the end here. Emily is a lecturer in creative futures at the ISF. Her work focuses on future-oriented, innovative trends in communicative and literary practices, and explores how preferable futures are being envisaged, anticipated, and made through art and literature. So the thing to remember is we've got an arty conversation to start with Emily and Pete. Stephen Hill, here, is a chartered planning and development surveyor with extensive public and private sector experience in both housing and planning. He is director of C20 Future Planners, Land Economists and Spatial Planners, as well as a board member of the National Community Land Trust and the UK Co-Housing Networks. He speaks and writes on professional ethics, citizen-inspired housing, and land and housing markets. He will be in conversation with Melissa Fernandez-Aragosia, who is a lecturer in urban futures at the ISF. Her work focuses on the realm of the home as a critical space, where historical desires, everyday life, and future aspirations intersect. She is particularly interested in the discourses, practices, and materialities that make and unmake housing during times of crisis and austerity in the name of imagined futures. So our second conversation is one very much about the idea of co-housing, how you plan for it, what kind of issues it raises from a practical and from a theoretical perspective. Moving on, we have Greg Davis to my right. Greg built and led for a decade the banking world's first behavioural finance team as head of behavioural quantitative finance at Barclays. In 2016, Greg founded Syntax, a firm dedicated to helping people and organisations make better decisions using the insights from behavioural science. He's an associate fellow at Oxford Saïd Business School, a lecturer at Imperial College London, and, most excitingly, the creator of Open Outcry, a reality opera that premiered in London in 2012 and created a live performance from a trading floor. So if things go a little off rail, you're going to conduct us out of the problem. He's going to be in conversation with Emre Tarim, who is a lecturer in behavioural sciences at Lancaster University Management School. Emre has published on sociological and behavioural dynamics of financial decision-making among professional and retail investors. He is currently researching how immigrants save and invest in host and home countries and what this implies for our understanding of immigration and integration. So a very interesting finance-based discussion thinking about the different time scales when it comes to economics and behavioural patterns. Our last conversation is between Michael Hebert and Carlos Lopez Galvez. Michael, right at the end of our line, has had a distinguished career that's taken him across disciplines including history, geography and planning. Since 2012, he's Emeritus Professor of Town Planning at the Bartlett School at University College London. Michael is the editor of Planning Perspectives, the leading international journal in planning history. And he was chairman of London Crossrail Design Review Panel, which must have involved quite a few interesting conversations, I should have thought, Michael. He will be speaking with Carlos Lopez Galvez as lecturer in the Theories and Methods of Social Futures at the ISF. He has published widely on 19th century London and Paris, including Global Undergrounds, which came out in 2016. His work interrogates the relationship between history and the future, with a focus on cities, infrastructure and cultural heritage. So our final conversation is very much bringing history, geography, the humanities back into that sense of how do we plan for the future in an urban context. Okay, that's enough talk from me. I'm going to pass you over to Emily, and then I'm going to just be the vicious person who intervenes every 15 minutes.
What Rebecca meant by Pete arriving in style is that he's going to miraculously appear on the screen in front of us. He's obviously a very well-respected author, and at the moment he's in Spain receiving a prize, so he can't be here in person. So we held our interview back in September, our conversation, and videoed it, and because I had the power of the editing suite, I was able to reduce myself to subtitles on the screen and really give Pete the whole stage to answer my questions and think through the concepts and ideas that I wanted to engage in with him. So here it is, and I'll pass you over to...
I must say, when I write, I don't think in those terms particularly. You know, I've got other concerns, probably more close concerns than such general concepts as aesthetic excellence. And so in my mind, when I'm thinking about it, I kind of flip it on its head, and I thought, well, what would anesthetic excellence mean? And that'd be like, I'm going in for an operation, and I want the anaesthetic to work really, really well, so I feel nothing. And so aesthetic excellence would be the reverse of that, where I'd have total feeling for the characters and for the problem, the situation they're in. I'm at one with them. I'm rooting for them in some way. That's in terms of the people, the characters. Then, for me, generally, I think art, I hate these generalizations, I just write, no, but when you reflect on it, art tends to, or at least narrative, tend to impose pattern. And some of the aesthetics are about that sense of harmony that comes from the imposition by the author of a pattern on the chaos. Plausibility, I think, and I guess it's just speculation for me, but readers will forgive a lot because, you know, that suspension of disbelief, they know it's a story, they know that it's not true. And if you can get the characters such that they in some way shine, they run in such a way that people feel, the readers feel, yeah, you know, I get this person. I'm not that person necessarily, but I get this person. I can feel what they feel, and I know why they're feeling that way. Even if those feelings are very extreme or based on unusual circumstances, that sympathy or empathy, whichever way it is, that the reader gets, that I think that's the bedrock of the plausibility. And so yeah, a lot of the arguments around early science fiction were that while the worlds created were magnificent, the characters were flat, the characters were so stereotypical or shallow that most people just didn't want to read it. And that's, that affected not necessarily the plausibility of the world created, but the idea that human beings would be walking among or within that world. So there was a tension, and there is a tension between those two things, maybe, between the world building and people building. It's that calibration. Of course, the best will build both really, really well. I'm not sure that when I wrote that novel, Black Star Rising, that I was thinking at all about plausibility. I can give you a backstory on it, which is bizarre, interesting. That I wrote the two before Black Star Rising, Lickshot and Professor X. I wrote them set in the now, as in set in the contemporary time, which was, let's not ask when it was, but it's a couple of decades ago. And I sent them off to the publisher, and they said, yeah, we'll publish them, but, to use your language, they're not plausible. This wouldn't happen now. Mainly, it's because I'd created this high-ranking black cop. There wouldn't be one. They said, it's impossible. The readers will just throw it away and say, no, fantasy. So what we'll have to do is set it in the future. And that's how I came to write the first two, set in the future, because the idea that there'd be a high-ranking black cop in the UK at that time was not believable, they said. So after I'd done those first two, I thought, well, if we're going to set something in the future, let's set it properly in the future. And that's how I came to write Black Star Rising. That was 1,000 years from now. But my concern really there was, well, first of all, in terms of audience and the plausibility for which audience, that I wasn't really writing for any readership other than the UK black readership, maybe the American black readership. That was what I was focused on. Wasn't really considering anyone else. And within that, I knew that science fiction had very few black people existing within it, certainly UK science fiction. And so there was this thought, we've been written out of the future, we've disappeared, So the act of writing Black Star Rising was to establish a couple of things. One, we will be in the future. And that was the first thing. Two, that counter to the stereotypes that sometimes prevalent, we can be rocket scientists as well as rock scientists, could be geologists, and linguists, all the other types of expertise, scientific expertise perhaps, but maybe not also from the humanities. There is no bar on what we can achieve in terms of thinking. That back then may have been somewhat controversial, or at least contrary to the stereotype. And then the third thing was that it's about who are we? Are we always going to be defined by white supremacy, as this phrase is? And what I was trying to do was say, well, okay, if we bring all these black people together in one place, then we can demonstrate or show characters who live much more full lives that of greater individuation, of greater specificness, of that can emerge more fully human than when they're being flattened by the pressures of a racialized society. So that was a third project or aim within the novel. And so, in terms of plausibility, the idea is, okay, here's the novel to the readers, can you see this? Can you share this future? Can you dream it? I like the idea of anticipation having kind of a positive and a negative, and you've got the anticipation positively. I think I always think about it in terms of when we're very young, 4, 5, 6, I don't know, 3, and our birthday's coming up, and there's no more intense positive anticipation than, you know, it's my birthday coming up, what am I going to get? And there's a kind of negative anticipation, which is the foreboding, the dread, which is kind of gothic or horror. Certainly with the thrillers, if you like, the crime fiction or crime thrillers that I've written, it struck me that thrillers are quite naive in some respects, because you've got this idea that there's a better world that can be achieved than the world that is the present of the story. And generally all the bustle and hustle of the drama, the plot, the action of thrillers is trying to get to that better world. Something's happened, something's going to go wrong, unless. But it's predicated on the idea that, you know, the world can be much better. The individual is able to achieve change, is able to affect the course of events, and in that way, the individual is empowered, and the main character is kind of a bit of a hero to be able to change that world. That's how thrillers, I think, work. And then the reader, spinning the cameras around, the reader is in the shoes, riding on with the main character as he goes about trying to transform that world, and by riding with them, they have this sense that maybe I too can change the world in some way. It's a good question, and I don't think I have a standard formula. For myself, I've been more and more interested in the idea that the novel is the examination of consciousness of what it's like for us as humans, what we carry in our minds, what we're thinking at any one time, what we're feeling at any one time. And in that sense, at any one moment, I sometimes feel we're here now. I'm doing this interview right now. I'm also remembering the chicken I ate 2 hours ago, and from that, you know, my mind's often operating. Maybe all our minds are operating in many places along that timeline at once, and the exploration of that is something that is intriguing and healthy. It's maybe important. It's something that writers can do, with that examination of consciousness, of what's going through our minds. So in terms of that, the question becomes, to some extent, to what extent are we living in the future, to what extent are we living in the past, and how much of the now are we carrying? One of the things that I've been meditating around, I've been looking at that equation, at those simultaneous existences we have, both in the past, future, present, and from that you start to theorize about the nature of time. So that big idea of time is actually bound up and wrapped up in the ontology, the nature of being, and you know, the existential questions about why we are here, if there is any meaning to life. And so at the moment, you know, what I've been working on or writing about is artificial intelligence, and how that that leap to sentience occurs. So then you think, okay, well, what is it about human beings that will keep the AI autonomous beings at bay? Well, we've got a handle on time that's better than theirs at the moment. You know, we can sift around through it, and we have that ability to speculate on the future, and we can come at things in vastly different ways. I guess maybe one thing that writing can do, if it does it, if it's so minded, is it can destabilize our understanding of ourselves and our understanding of the world of now. A lot of the dialogue or the work that is done by writers is reconstructions of the past, demolitions of the past, in order that the present is understood in a different way, and so that we may envisage a future that is different from the one that seems to be coming upon us, with some degree of inevitability. So writers tend to bring to the party voices that may not have been thought about, and connections that may not be being made by planners or those who speculate more technically about the future. And for that reason, we are very good stress testers of visions. We bring a different way of thinking about the future, and a more human-centered thinking about the future, to the table, to discussions or speculations on the future. And we're so, as a body of people, we're such misfits that between us we should catch a lot of things that others might miss.
Well, I think what Pete's thinking there really brought beautifully to the fore is precisely the ways in which the work he does is a kind of way of stress testing vision of the future. And I think that phrase puts it quite beautifully. And the ways in which the work he does really brings the human more sharply into focus in the process of building worlds. And I suppose there are lots of different fields where worlds get built. But I think what Pete showed so beautifully in his argument was that you can be proficient in creating and developing plausible worlds. So you can build worlds that are flawless in lots of different kinds of ways. But unless you also equally sort of build and take care about the ways in which you build the human beings who are going to be walking in that world, the world itself in the future won't actually be a complete vision of the future.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So that moves us nicely on to our first planning. Planning discussions. Yeah.
So quite a jump here. Thank you, Stephen, first of all, for coming here. Stephen was actually, as a practitioner, with a co-housing group immediately before this conversation, so it's very, very timely. I kind of wanted to start with a few comments for those of you that don't know or haven't heard about co-housing. I kind of wanted to get that out of the way and just say what the definition is, the very, very basic definition. Co-housing communities are intentional communities that are created, developed, and run by their residents. Each household has a self-contained private home that can be rented or owned, as well as a shared community space, and that shared community space is key to the definition of co-housing. Often these residential spaces are co-designed by the residents and architects, so there's a whole process there of co-design that's also core. The movement has a very long history. It's quite popular in certain European countries like Germany, the Netherlands, increasingly France, Spain, the US, Australia. It's becoming more and more popular in the UK. And Stephen is a member of the UK Co-Housing Network that represents members of that movement. Here, senior co-housing is specifically kind of designed co-housing for the over 50s. So I'll bring in that question of age and time into co-housing as well. For me, the key kind of reason why I brought co-housing to this space is because I think co-housing brings in the realm of the future in a number of ways, in a huge amount of ways actually. So in terms of planning, future home life is being planned for both at the individual and the collective level in these endeavors. The form, the meaning, and the practices of mainstream housing, so the housing we all kind of are near our associated to are being deeply unsettled and disrupted by these kind of citizen-led practice. So there's something about enacting an alternative future, but also disrupting senses of age. So particularly in senior co-housing, the way we think about age and our own futures, family futures, etc., tradition, that's being explored in very different ways. And finally, as housing and social and a political movement, because it involves all of this actually, it involves very different scales of anticipation. So you have the personal scale, as I mentioned before, so personal stories of family, of aging, etc. You have the collective scale of anticipating those futures, again about thinking about family and age. You have the design and material scale, right? That's anticipating and prefiguring how people live together and kind of molding that in a built environment form. And then you have the political or policy scale, where you have multiple actors, public, private, and alliances that are operating with very distinct temporalities or very different notions of the times that go into building these very different kind of anticipated futures, depending on priorities and interests. So, Stephen, I kind of see your role, in a sense, as a way to manage these very different scales. In a sense, you're speaking to many of these different actors that are involved in the co-housing world. And in a sense, just to kind of segue that with Emily's conversation before, I think you're creating a story about co-housing. There's something there that you're doing about creating a narrative for these different people that want to build co-housing or want to promote co-housing somewhere. So I guess my first question is back to this issue of narrative and storytelling, and whether you would describe your role as a storyteller of an alternative future, and also key there how history plays a role in that storytelling that you do, if that is the way that you conceptualize that.
Yeah, I think storytelling is a good way of thinking about it, because at the moment, our relationship with our housing, we're very passive consumers. We're very passive consumers of policy. Governments make housing policy entirely with the supply side. They never talk to the demand side. So our role as citizens, consumers, never gets factored into the way new housing policy emerges. Likewise, house builders don't really engage with consumers. They take a very limited view of how they're meeting demand. It's an industry that's notoriously unresponsive to demand. So I think we're not really accustomed to the idea that we can, as citizens, we can really shape what our housing looks like. I'm talking specifically about new building. We clearly have a lot more choice in relation to existing buildings, and papers are full of what we get up to doing in reshaping our existing environment. But when you look at what's being produced by the market, there's a kind of incentive where you have to, you're not going to buy it and then start mucking around with it. You kind of reshape it, you tell it what it is. So we're not very good at imagining that we could do more than we currently do. So the role of somebody like me is to simply unlock the possibility that other things are possible. And actually that doesn't really take much work in many cases, because if you ask people would they like to build their own home, there aren't many people who say no, because everybody in their mind has some kind of idea of an ideal fantasy, however fantastic. So I think it's the unlocking of that, or just creating space in which people can think about the things differently. Co-housing is specifically about kind of social organisation, and get a few people in the room, and it really doesn't take very long before people start having ideas and an actually creative environment. The job then is to help them reconcile whatever ambitions and creative ideas come out of that with the practical realities of getting the scheme built. But interestingly, more and more people are also thinking about reimagining where they live at the moment. So could they get some of the benefits of co-housing, some kind of social organisation in a neighbourhood, virtual networks, rather than going through the complete pain and agony of building a new development, which is about the most difficult thing you can imagine doing. And where I've been the this morning was the older women's co-housing group that some of you may have heard about. It's just finished Christmas, and it's up in New Ireland. It took them 18 years from that kind of first glimmer of the idea to moving in. The actual practical bit of when they started, they were complete pioneers. Nobody knew about co-housing, so they were trying to be champions of a new idea in an environment that was very non-receptive to new ideas, and then go about the practical business of being a developer with no capital, which is where most citizens are, because we don't have our own capital that we go out and do things. We're like small house builders, really. They're in a very similar position. But I think what they've managed to do, and I actually took a mainstream developer to see them this morning, and they were completely bowled over by the experience. I think partly by the scheme, which is lovely, but I think more particularly about the people who inhabit it. I think it was a real eye-opener to see how extraordinary, in a sense, ordinary people can do extraordinary things. And it just needed somebody, in that case, woman Connery Brent, to be that kind of facilitator that just started off the process of helping them imagine a different future.
Interesting. Just to kind of draw on that a little bit more in terms of the contrast between co-housing as something that's alternative or vision of an alternative future versus what we do get, which is mainstream housing. And you just mentioned a key example of the kinds of different actors that operate on very different temporalities and very different notions, for instance, of what the value of housing or future housing should be. So a mainstream housing developer, would be thinking about value as economic value, and they have these very complicated valuation processes, etc. Whereas a co-housing group has kind of social value that is being created as they act, and they are collectively thinking about what it is that they want to do, how it is that they want to live in the future. So in terms of your role, and you mentioned before, kind of unlocking that possibility, unlocking that creative potential of thinking about the future, how do you reconcile that mainstream kind of temporality of housing development with an alternative temporality?
Well, you have to do two things kind of simultaneously. One is you have to give the group they have to be very clear that they are embarking on a very capital-intensive, risky project. So there has to be a lot of discipline to that. But within that, you can also be very creative in imagining new ways of doing things, and things that don't cost a lot of money. Because most of what co-housing brings is their own kind of social organisation, that kind of creativity amongst people. And looking at the older women's co-housing scheme today with the developer, they're saying, well, basically they're doing some very simple things well. Good orientation, lots of light, lively circulation spaces that can be animated. Those are things that don't cost extra money. They just need to be thought about and designed well. And all the things that make it a special place with the potential for people to live more interesting lives as they get older are the things that the building facilitates that in terms of providing space, opportunities for social interaction. And it is the activities that people themselves start to animate the building. And I would say that when not just about co-housing groups, I'd say this is about all community housing groups, is that once they get going, all sorts of things start happening which were never planned, which is, in my opinion, is a really good thing. Because it's very important that people like me don't bring an overarching kind of financial discipline to it. That has to be the bedrock on which they're working, and they have to be realistic about where they're going to get the money. But then it's up to them to be thinking about the ways you want to live. I think what you find with most people is that they wouldn't necessarily call themselves as being very political. They're not seeing this as a political act, but actually it is highly political. They're articulating the way in which they want to live, which in many cases is simply not on offer. So if you're working with community land trusts, it's about effectively decapitalising your most valuable asset. You know, this is a place to live. It's not an investment, and it's an investment that it's an asset that has to be passed on to the next occupier and the next, so that they can benefit from it in the same way. Co-housing, I think, you know, our experience in the UK is mixed. So we've got they're mostly intergenerational, but they tend to be intergenerational at the top end of the age range, because these are people with existing housing equity, and that's a function of how difficult it is to raise money for this. So if there were other ways of raising money, it would be open to many more people, because much wider age range, ethnicity range, and income range.
It wasn't actually.
Also, sounded like a bell.
We are pretty much at time, so maybe just a few minutes. Yeah, just one last thought.
Okay, well, I had many other thoughts, but we had a conversation before, and I thought you used a really kind of powerful phrase when you were describing your role as a professional advisor of sorts, and you said, yes, it's all good to to anticipate the future, and that's what you're doing, and others are doing some sense, but that there is such a thing as too much anticipating. And I wondered if I could just pick your brain a little bit about what is the threshold of anticipation? Is there such a thing as a threshold of anticipation? And why do you see it as too much? What's so risky about anticipating too much?
Yeah, it's, I can't remember what my answer was. I think, in a sense, because you're talking about the way in which people's lives will pan out, so you shouldn't be trying to plan that too much, because business is it to do that. I think it's much more important that you have some kind of basic platform from which lots of things can happen. The co-housing group is a self-regulating entity. It has to take responsibility for how it makes that building function, how they live their lives within, and in the community around it. And I think it's more important that they've got that capacity to be adaptive and resilient over time, rather than imagining things too far in the future. And I think the real danger where I think happening is that in the end, ideas about clever technology take over, and you begin to forget about the social organisation. And in the end, it's the strength of the social organisation that will sustain that in the future.
That's a great place to move on. As whose business is it to plan out what's going to happen? Well, wait, I was supposed to be. Whoa, hello.
Yes, that's us.
We'll ask you that question, Imran.
Thank you, Rebecca. I think finance is an area where anticipation allows you to make money, or maybe forces you to lose money. So, and I think the reason why I wanted to talk about finance today is, maybe us as people, ordinary people, we don't think about finance so much because we kind of black box it. We kind of think that there's a certain technology to finance. It works in a certain way. It's efficient. Well, maybe it's not efficient, so you have a crisis. So we kind of black box finance. People involved in the financial markets. When you look at the way financial markets is studied, you can actually win a Nobel Prize in economics in the way you theorize about markets, and you can call them efficient, you can call everyone rational, but when you look at the real financial markets, Greg can allude to that. There's so much price volatility and so much trading activity that is not anticipated by Nobel Prize winning in theory. So, and I think my motivation comes from the fact that actually this is to do with different ways of anticipating, as Steve and Melissa actually talked about in the housing market. So there's not a huge difference between the housing market, the housing providers, and financial markets. Actually, finance professionals and retail investors which generate that kind of uncertainty by anticipating the future in different ways. And in doing so, because they share the same marketplace, they actually have to cope with it. So it's a very social, very relational thing, the way financial markets work. So that's why I'm here to ask Greg about his experiences as a behavioral economist and as a finance professional. How can we describe all these different ways of anticipating financial markets along the lines of professional investors, which we are actually very dependent on as pension fund holders. And also as retail investors, maybe some of us in this room, we are actually trading in the financial markets, if you're insane enough. And when I read, what Melissa and Steve said, they mentioned storytelling. It's a way of anticipating the future. Actually, finance professionals, in my view, they are doing the same thing, but they're actually also using mathematical models or calculative devices, but they combine them with different ways of telling stories about the future. So they frame the future, they actually perform the future as well. But we don't have one present and one future in the market. We actually have presence and futures in the market. So there's a plurality, and I think that plurality underpins the volatility and uncertainty in markets. So what I'm going to ask Greg to begin with is, how many different ways of anticipating have you experienced and seen in financial markets, Greg? Let's start with the professional investors.
Well, okay. So I'm sort of struck, you're focusing on investors here, and I think it's probably worth saying in advance that in addition to investing in financial decision making, there are all sorts of other decisions that we make as well. So we could think not just about investing, but also about savings decisions or about insurance decisions. And these are all things that effectively ask people to both rationally and emotionally trade off in their decision making how they feel in the present with certain aspects of the future and what they want to achieve or not achieve in the future. If I could slightly sidestep the focus on professionals, because I think there are some threads here that run through all financial decision making, regardless of whether you're a retail investor or a saver or a professional. This is, of course, very topical at the moment. You mentioned Nobel Prize winners for their work on markets and market structure, but the most recent economics Nobel Prize winner 2 weeks ago was Dick Thaler for his work on behavioral economics and behavioral finance, and indeed these issues of how regular people make decisions. But going back a little bit further before Dick Thaler, in 2002, the Nobel Prize for Economics was won by Daniel Kahneman, father of behavioral economics. And in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, he draws this distinction, which wasn't, by the way, originally his, although it's often attributed to him now, of this notion of System 1 and System 2 thinking. When we as humans make decisions, we make decisions not as though we have a single brain that is bored at that decision and comes up with a single answer. We seem to make decisions much in the way as though there are two separate systems of reasoning brought to bear on any decision we make. And one of those systems of reasoning is the one that we could call the deliberative brain. It allows me to walk sequentially and logically through a problem and figure out what the quote-unquote right answer is, what the answer that most maximizes my objectives. The other system is my emotional brain. It's the one that responds to narrative, the one that responds to stories, the one that has gut feel intuitions in it. And there's a huge, for many problems that we face in life, it doesn't matter that these two systems come to different answers. In fact, there's many situations where they come to the same answer. And then there's a bunch of things where it doesn't matter if they come to different answers. If you want to go to a coffee shop in the morning and you're trying to decide between the 59 different types of coffee on offer at Starbucks or whatever, it really doesn't matter that you haven't come to the optimal decision because the consequences are low. But for decisions like savings behavior, like investing, like insurance behavior, if your emotional brain comes to a different decision than your logical and deliberative brain would be, you've got an issue. Firstly, how do you square that circle? Which one do you follow? And the answer for most people is that we follow the emotional brain. We use heuristics, we have biases. We are, as humans, massively inclined to do what feels comfortable rather than what is the logically right decision. And that comes from a number of places. One is simply that to turn on our deliberative logical brain is taxing. It takes energy. And if you doubt this, I challenge you, try walking down the road with someone and at some point just spit out at them a quick problem of mental arithmetic. What's 213 plus 572? I have no idea what the answer is, but I guarantee you they will stop walking in order to give you the answer to that problem. Because it's hard work for us to think logically and sequentially through problems. And in financial decisions, we have this disconnect where You're asking people to solve problems that very often we don't face many times in our life. So we cannot learn from experience, because you only buy a house once every 10, 15 years or whatever. You only invest for retirement, or you don't do these things often, so you can't learn from experience. The other thing is, once you do make a decision, you often don't find out whether it was right or wrong until several months or several years into the future. So the feedback loop is incredibly slow. And the third reason is the rules are always changing. So unlike playing chess, where I can play the same game again and again and again with the same rules and I get quick feedback, that's where we can train our intuitive brain. We all know these stories of chess grandmasters who can glance at a chessboard and instantly see the next best move. They're not thinking logically through that sequentially. They just have trained their intuition. Financial decisions have none of those features. So we are in a world where it is very likely that the right answer is very different from the comfortable answer. And that's the constant tension that we have. So even professional investors, although they've got all these tools, the deliberative brain, I build an Excel spreadsheet, I plug into Bloomberg, I've got all the data, etc. It will spit out this right answer. I've done all my research, and yet there's still a corner of my brain going, yeah, but I'm just not comfortable enough with that. So you'll find that people, often in small ways, just deviate from what the logical thing is to do in order to satisfy their need or craving for immediate emotional comfort. And that's one of the things that I think causes this excess volatility that you measure. Because genuinely, the right answer for investing, if you're investing for something 10 years out, what you should do now doesn't change very much day to day. And yet we can observe that markets change phenomenally day to day. And there is no rational basis why the market should be as volatile as they are. And so the basis must be something else. And I think the basis is effectively on humans' emotional response to stories, to context, and to what we feel and what we read about in the newspaper every morning.
Okay, great. That's a fascinating journey into our brains. But I want you to be honest here. Who do you blame for most of the volatility stemming from the city? You don't have to name names, but is it the pension funds? The people that we trust our money. Is it the hedge funds? From an organizational cultural perspective, how do you see the greater picture, Greg, in terms of the sources of volatility? I understand we're all human beings.
Yeah. So there has always been volatility, and there's always been excess volatility. Our opinions of the world change faster than the world changes, frankly. We have to start classing investors into categories depending on their time horizons. So pension funds, for example, are probably not to blame for a lot of the volatility because they make decisions relatively infrequently and relatively slowly. Probably still too much. You can talk to a whole lot of people and ask a simple question. How often do you think you should buy and sell in order to do well in the markets? And it doesn't matter what people tell you the answer to that is, the right answer is less than you think you should. And so even for pension funds with really long time horizons, they're probably doing too much. Individual investors, or what are sometimes called noise traders, those of us who are just buying and selling on a whim, they are perhaps more responsible. A lot of professional investors who are buying and selling on faster things are even more responsible because they're buying large blocks of shares on a daily basis. But these days you have something that exacerbates that even more, which are the ultra short-term algorithmic traders. So effectively the machines doing this for you. And they inject extra volatility for two reasons. One is because they're responding on much shorter time frames, and they're responding, lightning fast. It's incredible. There are blocks of buildings in New York that are just filled with computers, and they are there because they want to be as close as possible to the stock exchange to minimize the length of fiber optic cable between when they receive the signal or not.
So they're going for the shorter distances. So kissing contest in a different
microseconds. And so one is they're doing much more, but the second problem with the algorithmic stuff is they respond to what they see other people doing, and then they exacerbate it. So you effectively see an amplification of signal. So it's not true that everyone is equally responsible for that volatility. And one thing that might be worth saying is actually, really volatility doesn't matter. It shouldn't matter. As an individual, if you're invested for a 5 or 10 year horizon, where the markets are going up and down today is absolutely irrelevant. The trouble is, it's only irrelevant in a logical sense. It's not irrelevant in an emotional sense because we see it going up and down and it worries us.
We have to make sense of it.
We have to make sense of it. But think about this, if you are a homeowner and the value of your house drops by 10% in the next 6 months, how would you even know? You would have no idea, so you wouldn't get stressed about that. That's one of the reasons why stock markets are so interesting, is precisely their liquidity and their transparency induces an emotional response in society that itself has a feedback loop to it that can be quite dangerous.
Yeah. From what you have told me, I mean, emotions seem to be playing a great role here, despite the fact that we have made so many advances, scientific advances, and technological advances. But at the end of the day, we are human beings. I mean, is there a normative side to, you know, how we understand the markets? Should markets be in a certain way, like the housing markets or the stock markets, or have we actually reached a certain, you know, level of development where we don't have to actually innovate or anticipate a different future? Are they functioning properly, or do you anticipate a different, more positive future as a practitioner and as a scholar?
So I think that's very difficult to answer without bringing a political and moral domain into this, because markets don't have a goal. Markets are simply a collection of transactions, and as such they are amoral. I mean, some people would say they're immoral in some way, but that is putting a political slant on it. So a market is a way of allowing people to do on a small scale what they want to do, and that aggregates up into meaningful activities. So this was, I mean, you mentioned the Open Outcry opera thing we did. It was to try and portray the beauty of the market, because in many ways a market is a bit like, you see those you know, if anyone's been watching the Blue Planet 2, right? These shoals of fish moving around, or flocks of birds in murmuration, and it's quite beautiful. But what you have is emergent properties of a whole group of individuals creating something that at the high level looks quite beautiful, but is constructed of individuals basically doing the much smaller thing. And that's what a market is. I mean, lots of little people doing little things, which creates big political and sociological consequences. So if the purpose of a market is to allocate capital or to spread risk around, then you kind of want them to be as efficient and unfettered as possible. If you want a market to lead to specific social distributive effects or justice effects, then you might want to sacrifice efficiency in order to achieve those goals.
And that's doable.
It's doable. It's a question. The question is who chooses what to do, and then it becomes a political question, not an emotional question, and well, probably an emotional question, but not a. It's not a question for market efficiency. It's a question for what we wish markets to be.
Yes.
What to do, to achieve.
Yes.
So,
and that's a great place to end, I think.
That's a great place to end. And again, I think just carrying a question forward, the question of who chooses what to do, how our choices inform about the past. We're going to get through to the humanities end of our conversation with Michael and Alex.
I think one way of connecting to the three conversations that we've had so far is by thinking about the relationship between locking and unlocking. And I like the idea of unlocking that actually takes about 18 years. And an interest that Michael and I share is to do with a city like London, but also the role that thinking about infrastructure in a city plays historically when thinking about the future of that city. So one of the to me very important questions that history raises is twofold. One is that largely there's nothing natural nor inevitable about things, the situations where we find ourselves. But also when you actually discover that next to, say, the envisioning of the London Underground in the 1830s or 1840s, or any of the cities where you live and the transport infrastructure that goes with it, that was just one of the visions. There were plenty of competing visions around the same time. So an important question that history raises is about the routes not taking. And I think that's key to understanding the relationship between history and the future. And the conversation that we're trying to have, or what we're going to have with Michael and that we rehearsed last night over a glass of wine, was to do precisely with a city that Michael knows very well, but also a character that is a key person in this story. So, Rebecca, if I could ask you to forward to you.
Yeah, okay, so here is the title page of a famous academic paper written by a statistician Colin Clark. Now, this is a statistician who is also an economic historian. It was a very, very long time frame. So this is history measured in millennia. He was writing in 1958, that's the date of this paper, and it's part of a series of very simple statistical modelling exercises he did about trends in urbanisation and settlement and food production and transport. And he compared multiple civilizations over spans of thousands of years. And he developed a law, the density distance rule. All cities in the modern period are tending to spread their density over a wider and wider area. And why? Because transport, which created the dense city in the 19th century, is destroying it in the 20th century. So writing in 1958, this is one of the key papers which demonstrated the inevitability of total motorization, the death of the compact city, the death of face-to-face interaction in the city, and the dispersal of population over extensive areas. One of the people who cited this paper very often was my doctoral supervisor, Peter Hall, who Carlos has just mentioned. Peter Hall, Professor Sir Peter Hall, who was one of the only academics I can think of who had a railway train named after them. The 5-car train set, number 378204, on the London Overground. It's a remarkable compliment to Peter Hall that he had this posthumous, it has to be said, he died the year before, a dedication of a train to his name. And this was the unveiling ceremony at Richmond Station in July last year. A great event. Now, why was it? It was because Peter Hall had actually conceived the London Overground. He conceived lots of things. He's actually, in his obituaries, attributed responsibility for the Docklands Enterprise Zone, for the M25, for HS1, for HS2, as well as for the London Overground. And in all of these projects, he was applying a different type of history. In a way, he rejected this early approach which he got from Colin Clark, a very modernist, a very 60s approach of planning for the death of cities and total motorization. He began to work, I should say, when I started with him, the first book he gave me was Herman Kahn, the year 2000. He was fascinated by futurology. He wrote, he was an early contributor to the journal Futures, but he always applied a historical approach. And his historical approach led to a rejection of that initial pessimism about the city. He began to work on agglomeration economies, on the role of cities in creativity, on the extent to which economic cycles and cycles of technological change, particularly as represented by the chondriative long waves, originated in changes in dense urban environments of face-to-face interaction, such as the cities which had been created at high density by the 19th century invention of railways. So in the later part of his life, he became passionate about trains. And his book, London 2000, 1962, was all about a London which would be penetrated right, left and centre by urban motorways, and was illustrated with visions of the Buchanan report. But by the end, he was much more thinking in terms of methods of facilitating the city that would involve a return to rail. So one of the things that he helped to visualise and to bring to the drawing board and to, he didn't live to see it open, but he lived to see it started, was London Crossrail. So our third image here is, thank you, Carlos, is a Liverpool Street station in London Crossrail, which illustrates two things. I mean, it illustrates this return to public transit, rail, cycling, pedestrian-friendly streets, reallocation of road space, which are so characteristic of European cities and hopefully American cities at the turn of the 21st century. And it also illustrates a different timescale of historical learning and historical shaping of the future. And that's part of the story of London Crossrail, is the failure of a Crossrail build in 1994, because it was engineer-made, dominated by putting in the infrastructure, designing stations, and insufficiently sensitive to the city into which this mighty engineering project, Crossrail, joining up the through railways through London, a dream since the 19th century, how this was going to be inserted into London. So the Crossrail build went through in the late 20th century and is now being almost completed, is going to open next year, is a very remarkable demonstration of a macro project as microsurgery, as keyhole surgery. So look at this is a railway station, which is going to be carrying tens of thousands of passengers, trains which are almost a quarter of a kilometre long, arriving at a frequency of 2-minute head time. Every 2 minutes, these massive trains coming direct from Heathrow, direct from the West Country, crossing the platforms of Reading, direct from Kent and London Docklands and South Essex. And yet, when they arrive at Liverpool Street, we see how the mighty flows of passengers are being channeled into rat hole entrances, one of them coming up in the forecourt of Liverpool Street Station, the other coming up into the ground floor of a single block, a single building at Moorgate.
Could I interrupt you?
Yes, I'm sorry.
You're perfectly on time. I have my watch here.
Okay.
It's my watch.
I think one of the things that I'm taking out of this, fascinating, I guess, tracing the development of a line like this through individual characters, someone like Peter, but also through influential articles like Colin Hawkes and ways of thinking more than anything else. Because you train as a historian, you've been a geographer as well, and a planner, you work in Crossrail and so on and so forth. Could you tell us a bit about the different sets of skills that you can draw on when actually entering discussions where the dominant language, for example, may be the language of the engineers, or in a different meeting, the dominating language is going to be the language of the capitalists, the people with the money. Or if you enter a conversation with the local council is going to have very specific concerns about, for example, affordable housing and so on.
Yeah.
So do you think the more skills that we actually as individuals bring into the table, the better place we are to actually be able to inform decisions in a way that actually acknowledges the rules of the past, but also the limited visions of the future?
Well, all planning, all urbanism, all city design is about anticipation. And the techniques that planners use are intrinsically anticipatory. And they have to use both sides of the brain 1 and brain 2. So there's a lot of plan tech, which is all to do with modelling. It involves logical positivism, it involves numerical modelling, it involves understanding data series and the ability to capture data, to model it and to roll it forward. That's very, very important. And the other is a historical imagination which is much more dialectical, which understands that preferences can change very radically within the space of not only a generation, but in the space of the fashion cycle, which is an annual cycle pretty well. And these two things, and I mean, anybody who works with designers knows that visualization, realization of models and computer virtual reality environments and maquettes and written prose, I mean, language, all of these things matter to bring to the consumer, the public, the sense of what the future could be, which is not necessarily apparent. And I mean, the amazing thing about Charlie Plank, which was Peter's film, and his wife, is is the rapidity with which things can change. And I think, you know, from 1950s, when Colin Clark wrote, universal power ownership will come sooner or later, and the prudent planner must make his plans accordingly. And this meant building those urban motorways and planning for decentralisation. And the change of that to the reallocation of road space we see in our great Paris, London, New York today is fantastic.
Well, yes, we still have time. Would you want to open it to this?
Are you bored?
No, I'm just conscious of the time, and that's fine. I can carry on, that's fine.
Maybe just one last,
Couple of minutes.
yeah.
Okay. I had the privilege to meet Peter. This about, I think it was 4 years ago. I organized a conference here in Senate House in collaboration with the London Transport Museum. And this was to mark the anniversary, the 150 years of the opening of the first section of the Metropolitan Railway in London. Michael was the closing plenary speaker, and we stay in touch ever since. But one thing that I took from the very short exchange with Peter is two things. One is to do with sensitivity to different cultures. He lived in different countries, he spoke different languages, but similarly, when you actually deal with subjects like this, which is perhaps like hard engineering, perhaps like the numbers, the stats, the calculations, they have to be in place. But effectively, cities are actually about people. And so he will always place people before anything else. And that is something that sometimes when you read reports by, for example, the Foresight report by the government on infrastructure, or even the infrastructure plan for London 2050, it's really hard to pin down where these people and who these people are. Do you have any reactions and comments?
No, I think it's an extremely valid point that it's the two sides of the brain again. And I think what's interesting in Peter Hall's work, which by the way is 53 or 54 books and thousands of articles, he was an extremely prolific writer. But over time he became more and more interested in the role of utopias as vehicles for thinking about the future. And the history of utopias, for example, utopias such as the Garden City. His final book that he published in his last year, The Social City, was a combination of going back to late Victorian utopianism, Henry George, Edward Bellamy, Ebenezer Howard, and a completely contemporary look at the European urban system facing the challenge of sustainability in the early 21st century. And I think it's an interesting answer to your question, that as well as the abilities to visualize and to handle data, a novelistic, to complete the loop, ability to write science fiction is a useful door into possible futures.
That's a wonderful place to bring our conversations full circle. Thank you very much. I think what I'd like to do is just see if I can pull another line through everything that we've heard so far. So we had the idea of storytelling, which Pete set up really nicely for us, and I think everybody's engaged with that idea of storytelling and how that helps us in all sorts of different walks of life think about the future. The other thing that I thought was coming very strongly from all of your conversations was this idea of a time lag. That there is some, that you, in each different context, you have to reckon with some kind of a time lag. So the 18 years co-housing between the glimmer of the idea and the realisation, that was the kind of the first really stark figure we heard. But actually it looked like nothing when we heard about Crossrail, which had a failed attempt in 1994 and is only going to come to fruition in 2018. And I wouldn't be surprised if actually that can be traced further back into the past as well. The glimmer of the idea probably goes way further back. And then we had, I thought it was really interesting from Pete's talking about how his novels came about, that he had this idea of the high-ranking black police officer and it just wouldn't be plausible, so he had to boot it into the future. So there's that time now that he was able to, or kind of had to use sort of some form of science fiction or future-focused writing for. And then we had the feedback loop on the financial decisions, that you don't often actually really know whether it was the right decision or not until some time has passed, whether it's going to, I think your point was that it's a significant amount of time. So I thought that was kind of interesting, that how much have we really reckoned with when we think about visions of the future or different kinds of futures. Are we really attuned to that timeline, and what? Maybe I could ask our practitioners to just think about anything that comes to mind, having heard other fields, other concerns about dealing with the time lag.
I think there are two sorts of time. One is just the physical time it takes to get something built, which is kind of long, much more important perhaps, which is something you have to build into that. But what you're also creating in that process is the capacity to deal with time and manage what's going to happen in the future, which is a whole other thing to think about. And I think we have to worry more about the second thing than the first. The first thing is just kind of temporary. And I'm just kind of, a bit of my experience was working for Government International Agency English Partnerships, which is managing the Millennium Communities Programme. Now kind of vanished into history, actually. And it was a kind of brave attempt by a very passionate Secretary of State to try and get the house building industry to create more better designed, more lively social places. It was completely the wrong medium through which to do it, because house builders, and what we discovered was that only one of about 8 house builders had any R&D capability at all. So how were they supposed to develop new products and new ideas? And essentially it wasn't about the bricks and mortar, it was about who was going to live there, how they were going to live. And so without actually being able to engage them, engage the demand side, you're not building any future kind of resilience or capacity to be adaptive. And they're just kind of very ordinary places. And that's very special about them. And they're sort of out of date, they're obsolete, almost before they begin.
If I could pick up on that, because I think one of the strongest elements of good decision making is the notion of how you go about the planning process, and both of you mentioned planning a lot, and that thing you just mentioned of adaptability is vitally important. And there are all sorts of examples where, well, if I just take the corporate world, typically you create a strategic plan for a company, and the CEO will judge your strategic plan to be good or bad, normally based on how detailed the plan is. So the more lines it's got in the Excel spreadsheet, the more stakeholder checkpoints, the more KPIs, the better the plan. But really, simply, the more detailed your plan is, the sooner it's going to start deviating from reality, because reality changes and circumstances change. And some organizations that have had hundreds of years of experimentation to deal with this problem are the military organizations, who, of course, have planning processes that internalize this notion that no plan survives first contact with the enemy. But in all planning processes, no plan survives first contact with reality. You mentioned changing preferences, and they can change very fast fashions. But so does the political environment, so does the economic environment. And so my view of planning is important. And I can't remember who it was who said plans are completely unimportant, but planning is vital.
Almost every general you can ever
yes. Multiply determined, yes. But if you're going to create a plan, the real problem with the planning is that not only do people do it in too much detail, but while they're doing it, they get emotionally invested in that plan. And by definition, the moment you turn that plan on and you push go, it is overfitted to your current knowledge base, and it is overfitted to the reality of the current world. And because you're emotionally connected, what you often find as plan and reality start deviating is people start making excuses for the plan, and they double up, and they double up. And so if you're going to create a plan, what is vital is that you not only create a plan, but you simultaneously create a process for how you are going to change that plan over time. You can think about this as a constitutional process. If countries write a constitution, it's there to ensure that there are certain things we don't wish to do, even if we're in a situation of crisis because they don't align to our principles. And a constitution, however, is not immutable. It can be changed, but it should only be changed more slowly than circumstances arise. So you should never change your constitution to shove through a single decision. Your constitution is only changed through a supermajority vote in 2 houses of parliament, etc. But the vital thing there is you have not only a set of rules or a plan, you have a set of rules and a plan plus a process for how to adjust it over time. And very often that second bit, certainly in finance and in the corporate world, that second bit is completely forgotten about. So people love their plan right up until the moment when they hate it. They turn it off, they fire someone, they go, we never do that this way these days, and then they rinse and repeat.
Emily, can I ask you to just channel peace?
I'll do my very best.
Because I was just struck while Greg was talking that you could talk quite against the emotional identification, Greg, that goes on, but yet Pete was talking about precisely the need to have empathy with the characters, and his point about world making, that early science fiction made these brilliant worlds, but their characters were flat, and the readers couldn't empathise with the characters. And he made the same point about thrillers.
Just a quick book, because I don't wish to sound in any way that I'm against emotion.
Yeah.
There's always wonderful literature from psychology that there are people who are genuinely unable to experience emotion because they've got frontal lobe damage in certain ways. And far from emotionless people becoming better decision makers, they can become absolutely, well, they can't make decisions. Because if you have no way of attaching emotion to future states of the world, you have no basis on which to make a decision. So you sort of swim around going, well, I don't really care about anything. So,
absolutely, yeah. And that is actually one of the points that Pete made in our conversations, and that was a long conversation sort of edited down, is the thriller, in a way, invests in this idea of there being, something better. And it's an emotional investment, absolutely. And his point was that, what would a nihilist novel look like? It certainly would be a thriller with that idea that it would be, there would be a future world that might be worth making changes for, making transformations for. But I wanted to say a couple of things about the question of the time lag. If you were speaking, we've been talking about the ways in which it took 18 years for this particular housing project to actually really distinguish time lags on various kind of forms and ways. And it reminded me very much of what in literary studies would be called the avant-garde, a particular period or genre. And the idea that there are sort of forerunners of style, taste, genre, experimenting and pushing things forward, and at that time the wider cultural context is often alienated by whatever development it might be. Modernism was one perfect example where Ulysses was greeted with moral outrage at the time that it was published. And it's only then later, after this timeline, that the creative practitioners like Joyce, Joyce in particular, thinking about modernism, like Woolf, are recognised as having made fantastical transformations to the future of that particular cultural practice, in that case, literary scholarship. So there is a sense, I think, that those forerunners of the avant-garde are often vilified in their own time, but actually, unbeknownst to them, often, and it can take a long time, but they have often changed the broader cultural context and that particular field in ways that are probably not tangible to them at the time, but that they were necessary. Their interventions were in many ways necessary for that sort of broader sea change to occur.
I wonder what we take from that, because the other kind of thread that I had that was running through things was this idea of destabilising, that human creativity, very broadly defined, destabilises, and this becomes inherently political. I think that was your point, that the alternative models that then challenge the...
And those models feel very threatened, even though they're much more powerful.
Yeah.
Sort of way politically powerful, they feel deeply threatened by people wanting to do things for themselves.
So I'm just wondering how you turn that into some kind of positive sense of how do you know you're doing the right thing for the future? Is it that you're in the political hotlands, as it were, and things are getting tricky around you, but you wanted to come in, Michael?
Well, on time lags, I'm not sure about the concept of time lag. it's rather like driving a dodgy old vehicle with spongy brakes. I mean, the concept of time lag implies that if you keep pressing the brake pedal long enough, sooner or later it'll connect. But think of the nightmare scenario in which you press the brake pedal and you keep pressing the brake pedal and it doesn't connect, and you roll into disaster. I mean, I think it's a missing key question, maybe. That take climate change. You know, we've known about climate change as a reality and global warming. We've known since the 1960s. The Intergovernmental Commission has been meeting since the 1990s. All of us involved in environmental research thought it was a time lag problem, that sooner or later the penny would drop. But since the last American election, I mean, the most frightening aspect has been realizing the penny's not going to drop. The brakes aren't going to connect. There are our ability to anticipate is faltering. So the Cassandra factor is missing, I think, in this scenario.
Does anybody want to help us out of our extremely depressed end?
I suppose I would just say I'm not sure that we can anticipate there's a lack of care. I mean, you know, who cares? There are some people who simply do not care that certain things are going to happen. They may be able to anticipate it. The question is they don't feel responsible for it, they don't feel connected to it. So I don't think it's just, we can't load it all onto our anticipatory capacity. Some of this is other stuff. Some of this is disconnections of a whole, yeah, sorry.
And there I would say that, and that's precisely Pete's point, that one of the things that he does, and sees it very, very consciously in his own work, is trying to activate precisely that intersubjective, empathic encounter between the reader or the consumer of whatever piece of creative work it might be, and an imaginary other, right? So to develop that kind of empathic capacity.
I just want to add something on that, and you know how Greg finished his discussion. You know, markets don't have to be amoral. You know, you look at the whole asset management industry nearing $100 trillion, and almost 10% of that is socially and environmentally responsible investment. So these people are actually investing in, you know, for the climate change, to prevent climate change, and it is possible. And in that sense, you know, markets don't have to even prioritize efficiency all the time, and it's happening right now. Yeah.
But it's often, I mean, this morning in this break, when we were having a conversation precisely about responsibility and the responsible and anticipation, I think it was the term used. And often that comes as a response to, for example, the UN estimates about the global population growing rapidly, so that by 2050 you will have 9.7 billion inhabitants. Between 60 to 17% of those living in cities. And the majority of the growth between now and 2050 concentrated in Africa. So of course that's a doom scenario. But actually, when you take the long perspective, if you read archaeology, you realize that actually one of the things that there's a wonderful article published in the 1950s by Gordon Child, which is called the Urban Revolution. And he looks at 4 different nation cities. And the key word for him is solidarity. It's actually not the houses, it's solidarity. It's people coming together. So if actually people come together to cities and make a living in cities, then exactly the same prediction can be understood in a completely different way. And I think I guess part of our responsibility is precisely to diversify those stories.
I think we've got time for just one more question.
Well, there were conversations across 4 different domains, each of which are moving kind of forward into different futures of transportation, of housing development, of literary of markets. So on the others, to what extent, though, are some of these larger forces that have just come up in the summary being considered in this planning discussion? So climate change wasn't mentioned until we had this kind of common discussion. Kind of post-capitalism wasn't mentioned by Greg, or kind of perhaps significant dislocation in connected markets in the future. So how are we not? And I think this could be a positive direction. So as I'm working with climate change planning with municipalities myself and using foresight methods, they're seeing this as very positive. So in what ways are, I guess I wanted to ask the panel, in what ways are you introducing kind of these larger dislocating forces that need to be considered in perhaps nearer futures that we would like?
I mean, just one quick response to this. I mean, the climate change thing is fascinating from a decision science angle, because when I talk about that dislocation between the right answer and the comfortable answer, the comfortable answer for a lot of people now is, well, this climate change thing is kind of, it's complex, it's frightening, and it's a long time in the future, so why engage? And trying to narrow that gap between comfortable and right, I think this is one area. So, I mean, just as an example, I've been doing quite a lot of work in the last 3 years on this notion of impact investing, and how you get people to start seeing their social preferences as and their financial preferences as part of the collective whole, rather than what most people do when they're faced with a complex problem, is we compartmentalize and we go, well, if I want to do some social good with my wealth, then I'll give £8.50 a month to the Red Cross, assuage my social guilt, and I'll keep my financial portfolio as rapacious as possible, because that's only about finance. And if we can find ways of helping people to see these things in bigger bubbles, as it were, we might start addressing that. It's just one small example, but I think there are
more holistic reasoning.
I'm not going to say this is going to solve it, but there are certainly tendrils reaching out.
Yeah, thank you for that question, because I was going to say that I'm not having any of this pessimistic stuff. Because, I mean, we've already seen the reaction to Trump's decision to come out of the Paris Agreement is actually there are cities and communities and states and companies who actually really want to do something about it. And so they are doing something. It's not just about thumbing their nest to Trump. And I think in kind of the urban planning realm, I wouldn't say I'm an anti-planner, but I'm an anti-rational planner. Because I think what you see in community housing groups is people who've got a very clear idea of how they can live differently. With help, they can realise that. And they may only be doing it in a small scale, but that's actually how cities work. Cities are fractal structures, lots of self-similar pieces, but you get enough of them. And if anybody knows Arlo Guthrie is Alice's restaurant, and so on, if you get enough people doing it, people will think it's a movement and change the world.
Let's end on that note.